Hello, everyone. It is 5:30 Monday evening, and it is time for this week's episode of Riding in Cars with Cards. It's been a little over a week, and I'm sorry for that, but thank you. Before I dive any further into all of this, I want to say thank you to everybody that reached out to me and mine while we were going through Esther's surgery on the 4th, and in the week after, our first week of recovery. There's been a lot of support from the community at large, whether it's been in person, just good vibes on Twitter, and some people have really stepped up and done far more than I expected anyone to care enough to do. So thank you from the bottom of my heart to everyone. Y'all know who you are. Thank you. So with that out of the way, we're going to dive in. This is Riding in Cars with Cards. This is the show that I do in order to apply the lessons that I try to teach on Homeward Path every week. Homeward Path is supposed to be about more evergreen content, concepts and content that is applicable across a wide range of formats and, things you can learn as standard evolves over the years, as modern changes with new cards entering the format. Like, this show is about specific examples of each thing that I'm trying to teach on Homeward Path. Excuse me. So, this week's focus for Homeward Path is going to be on linear decks. It's what I wanted to do last week. My computer bit the dust, or at least is about to. I didn't want to get like half uploaded and then have a corrupt file and just have to, there was a lot that was going into that I just didn't want to ruin, suffice it to say. So we backed out. I'm going to go ahead and do that episode this week. So that gives me a chance to do an example on it instead of just doing it in the dark. This week's deck is going to be Infect in Modern. And there's a couple of reasons I chose Infect. There's a lot of linear decks in Modern. That's kind of the nature of the format. It's a very fast, a very aggressive format. It's a format that rewards mastery of your deck frequently over metagame knowledge, over, sideboarding decision, common sideboard plans. Like, learning the format through the lens of a deck tends to be a very effective way to get into Modern. And that's given rise to a slew of linear decks in Modern. Decks like Boggles, decks like Infect, decks like Mono Red Prowess, decks like Burn, decks like Dredge, decks like over the summer we had Hogak. I don't know if y'all were aware, but Storm, all these decks that just want to try to kill you on turn 3. So why did I choose Infect? Infect is the purest implementation of everything that makes linear decks what they are. Which is to say, it's the purest example of a deck that is no nonsense. It's going to do what it does and literally nothing else. So, for starters, what in the world is Infect if you've never played Modern before and you don't know what we're talking about? Infect is a mechanic that debuted in the Scars of Mirrodin block and really came to a head when we got two creatures in New Phyrexia in Glistener Elf, a 1-drop 1/1 with Infect, and Blighted Agent for 1 and a blue that is an unblockable Infect. And the mechanic reads, this creature deals damage to other creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters and to players in the form of poison counters. Now, poison counters are kind of a weird, a little bit abstract mechanic over the years. When they show up, they tend to do literally nothing or actually everything. And there's been a couple of instances of it over the years. Most notably, the Flash Hulk deck during its tear through Legacy. There was a build of it that played it as its Protean Hulk package would go get 4 copies of Virulent Sliver and Heart Sliver on your first turn. So all slivers have Poisonous 4. When they attack and aren't blocked, the defending player gets a poison counter. And Heart Sliver gave him haste, so you just get everybody an attack and deal your opponent 20 poison counters. Fun fact, you only need 10. And that's why Infect is such a good example of a linear deck. Because linear decks are effective when they're allowed to do, when they're capable of doing 2 things. One is implementing a game plan very, very quickly. And 2 is getting paid off in a way that breaks the rules of the game. And Infect does that in spades. Because the way it breaks the rules of the game, getting paid off for what it does, which is being just kind of a bajanky pump spells deck. You're playing a bunch of mopey creatures. One of them's unblockable. One of them's a 1-drop. One of them's a land that flies. Like, that doesn't sound like a winning strategy until you realize that Infect gets paid off for playing this strategy by going all in on this strategy because it only has to deal 10. Only needing to deal 10 damage as a pump spell aggro deck is a huge deal. Because a card like Blossoming Defense that reads target creature gets +2/+2 and hexproof until end of turn might as well say +4/+4. I mean, it doesn't help the creature beat over a 6/6, but it doesn't have to, because that extra 2 points of power early in the game on your 1/1 Infect creature, if you're getting in, is like hitting them in the face for an extra 4. Getting hit for 3 poison counters is like getting hit for 6 battle damage. It's kind of a big deal. Just a little under a third of your starting total. So by buying into the Infect mechanic and the advantage that it gives you, the deck is allowed to be way faster than a pump spell aggro deck has any business being. That's Patrick Chapin's suggestion when it comes to building linear decks, borne out on the cardboard, which is make sure you're getting paid for what you're buying into. Well, if I'm buying into a pump spell aggro deck, but in exchange I only have to deal half my opponent's life total, and I don't actually care if they gain life, that's great. That is fantastic. So let's start to break down the list. I have mostly memory. Like, I can't remember exact numbers on all the pump spells, but I remember all the spells they were playing. But I do remember the creature numbers. First and foremost, it was 4 copies each of Glistener Elf, Blighted Agent, and Noble Hierarch, and then 1 copy of Dryad Arbor, which you play in Infect to be fetchable as an out to Liliana the Veil or other types of edict effects. Because you are very much a go tall deck. You want 1 creature to just kill your opponent by itself. And having a fetchable piece of interaction to deal with effects that make you sacrifice creatures. Because between some of the pump spells you're playing and the 1 non-pump spell or Infect creature in the deck, like, you can handle spot removal to an extent. What you can't handle as well is a bunch of edict effects. So having fetchable insurance to an edict effect that you don't have to spend mana on is great. But it doesn't stop there. Like, that's all Dryad Arbor is. It's a land creature, forest druid, I think forest dryad, maybe. But it's just a 1/1 land creature that you can fetch out of your deck with a Misty Rainforest. Noble Hierarch, it's one of those cards that, like, it doesn't make the deck playable. It's not the reason you can play the deck and be successful, but it is definitely one of the reasons the deck is competitive at the higher levels. both turboing you ahead 1 mana for turn 2 and adding an Exalted trigger, which is like getting an extra like half a pump spell or a quarter of a pump spell for free every time you attack for each Noble Hierarch you have in play. That's not nothing. That adds up to almost a card over the course of 2 or 3 turns. It's not nothing. It can get there. I've seen players playing Infect get there on the back of specifically Noble Hierarch and Inkmoth Nexus beats. It's it's little bits of chip damage value that really can't be understated. It's really quite good in the deck. That being said, as someone who is a budget-minded player, that's going to be one of the last cards I get. Just FYI, anyone who's interested in how I would build this deck budget-friendly, that's going to be the first place I start. I would cut all the Noble Hierarchs before I would cut a single Inkmoth Nexus. But that's your creatures. Glistener Elf, Blighted Agent, so there's your Infect creatures, a Dryad Arbor, and 4 Noble Hierarchs. Well, then we dive into those non-creature spells, and oh my heavens, there's a lot of them. The deck is playing 21 lands, including the Dryad Arbor, so 20 lands other than the Dryad Arbor. Some collection of fetch lands, breeding pools, botanical sanctums, like the normal trappings. Pendlehaven is also just very good in the deck. And then 4 copies of Inkmoth Nexus that turns into a 1/1 Infect flying creature, which is super relevant here. And then we have all these disgusting pump spells. First and foremost, you have the combo, if you will. For a long time, the deck played multiple copies of Become Immense. You don't have to do that anymore. We got a better toy in Modern Horizons, and that card is Scale Up. Turning your Infect creature into a 6/4 and not having it lose abilities is just a touch on the busted side. +5 is like getting +10. I keep mentioning this, but you give your Blighted Agent +6, or make it a 6/4 with 2 Noble Hierarchs in play. You attack and then have Blossoming Defense, and your opponent dies. You cast Scale Up with double Noble Hierarch in play. Your opponent attempts a bolt, and you respond with Blossoming Defense. Guess what? Your opponent's dead. They're just dead. That wouldn't be the case with a different style of deck. A red-green prowess or something like that. That's just not as good. So Scale Up was a godsend to this deck by providing this massive spike in power to your creatures for basically no mana. Like, really, 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 really good. And then alongside Scale Up, because we definitely want to play as many of these kinds of effects as we can, you have some number each of Groundswell, Might of Old Kroza, and Mutagenic Growth. Normally, it's 4 each of Groundswell and Mutagenic Growth, simply because Groundswell doesn't require you to cast it at sorcery speed to give you the +4/+4. But obviously, you want some number of Might of Old Kroza just to add redundancy, make sure you have more +4/+4 pump spells. You just keep growing your big, stupid animal bigger, and it kills your opponent. It's classic pump spell aggro. But getting to do that to only deal 10 is the goal. Yeah, you have games where you end up like embarrassingly on the Noble Hierarch beatdown plan, and you probably lose, but sometimes your opponent's hand is really bad after they ripped yours apart. They don't actually have a lot of removal, just a lot of disruption, and you can get there that way. Whatever. I don't care. It's not what we're here to do. Now, those are the generic pump spells. Those are efficient from a mana to power and toughness boost standpoint. Like, they're really efficient in that regard. The next one is a little bit of a different animal because it is less a pump spell and more just an evasive spell. And that card is Distortion Strike, which is target creature gets +1/+0 and unblockable until end of turn. And it has Rebound. So you can add an extra point and unblockable, and then get it again. In response to my rebounded copy coming in, I'm going to animate my Inkmoth Nexus, make it a 1/1. Now it's a 2/1. My turn, draw, attack with double Noble Hierarch, get in for 4. Crack, Fetch, Groundswell, Mutagenic Growth, kill you. These are things you can do. And even if they have flying blocks, they don't block because, unblockable. It's right there in the card. But then we have the protection spells in the deck. And 2 of them double as pump spells. The first one being Blossoming Defense that we talked about earlier. +2/+2 and Hexproof for a green. It's almost as powerful as Dive Down. Well, it's more powerful than Dive Down was in the Mono Blue Tempo and Is It Drake's decks. If you really want to double down on that kind of effect, you can play some Dive Downs on the board. If you think your opponent's going to be really, really heavy on spot removal, you can aim for a little bit of a slower start and just make sure you get in. I don't necessarily recommend it because Dive Down boosting toughness only is a little bit of an issue for me. But I can understand where you're coming from if that's something you decide you want to do. So, the other is Vines of Vastwood, which is target creature gains hexproof until end of turn. If Vines of Vastwood was kicked, its mana cost is a green and then its kicker cost is another green. If Vines of Vastwood was kicked, that creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. The number 4 comes up a lot in this deck, and that's because 2 hits with a 1/1 Infect creature pumped by +4 ends the game. That's the long and short of it. As long as you can deal 10, you win. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to just get in 2 hits. For all the possibility it has on one-shotting your opponent, at the end of the day, you can just get there by spending, a couple of cards and your opponent not respecting it. You don't have to necessarily overthink it. And then the last spell, or the last non-creature spell in the main deck is Spell Pierce, and I believe they were playing 3 copies. Again, I don't remember the exact breakdown of the pump spells versus, which each pump spell. I do remember they were playing 1 copy of Become Immense for the lulz, I guess. The card is just obnoxious. +6/+6 is so much. And again, you have your 1-drop Infect creature, and you've got double Noble Hierarch, and you attack for 3, make it cast the Become Immense to make it 9, and your opponent attempts to remove it, and you have the Blossoming Defense, and your opponent dies. Somehow this keeps coming up. Your opponent just seems to die if they don't play right. So, at the end of the day, that's what all Infect does. You threaten to kill your opponent every single turn of the game after about turn 2. Sometimes on turn 2. Sometimes your hand is just nutty. And then land-wise, the most notable non-basic land in the deck by a substantial margin is Inkmoth Nexus, being able to pick up all these pump spells and just go skyward, even when your opponent's playing a bunch of removal for your creatures. You can still just ride that wave. And it is definitely a deck that is going to... It's either going to be great or it's going to be awful, and that's another function of linear decks. If people are playing stuff that beats you, your deck is not good. And that's definitely the case with Infect. If there's a lot of Edict effects, you are not a good deck in there. You are not good against that. If people are playing a bunch of fair mid-rangey creature decks, oh, it's on, man. Let's go get them. It's time to poison some people. So, at the end of the day, that's the goal that's why we're talking about Infect. It is one of the purest examples of a deck that buys all the way in on its premise. It favors redundancy over flexibility. Everything about the deck is engineered to do the same thing, which is get a creature with Infect on the board and kill your opponent with it. Like, I wish we could say there's more complicated to it and there's more nuance to it. And there's definitely more nuance to piloting the deck in game. Like, it's not just full-on helmet mode, to borrow a term from Yu-Gi-Oh! It's not full-on helmet mode where you just sit down, play your creatures, and let things happen as they will. You've definitely, there's a huge skill gap between good Infect players and bad Infect players when it comes to protecting the small number of threats the deck has. Because in the grand scheme of things, the deck only has 12 threats that kill the opponent. 4 Glistener Elf, 4 Blighted Agent, and 4 copies of Inkmoth Nexus. If you can answer all of that meaningfully, you win. If you can't, they almost certainly will. So, why am I suggesting Infect now? I've talked about all these other decks over the course of the summer, especially as it relates to Modern. I talked about decks like Is It Phoenix? I talked about decks like Mono Red Prowess. I talked about decks like Burn. Why am I talking about Infect now? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, it is one of the better, ease yourself into Modern decks. Because the game plan itself is easy to execute. So a lot of how good or bad you do with the deck comes down to how you sequence your plays. How well you read what kinds of removal effects your opponent might be on. Things of that nature. As opposed to a deck like Jund, a deck like Blue-White Control, where you've got to not only know how your deck functions, you've also got to know how every other deck in the metagame functions in order to be able to counteract the correct plays every turn. In fact, you just kind of do your thing. You just kind of take a guesstimate based on how they're playing, based on the colors they have access to, as to what they're trying to use to break up what you do. And then you position the spells necessary to make sure it doesn't work. And then the other reason I suggest Infect is you look at the price tag. And this is a network or a content grouping, if you will, about budget Magic. It's about playing Magic on the cheap and using cheaper decks to upgrade into better ones over time. And if you can stomach buying Inkmoth Nexus, the rest of the core, the rest of the deck that actually kills your opponent is really, really cheap. I mean, Glistener Elves, $1. Blighted Agents, maybe $1. Out of your pump spells, I think Scale Up is going to be the most expensive. Spell Pierces are basically free. Blossoming Defenses are maybe $1. Probably not even that much. Just all the way around, there's a lot to choose from when it comes to pricing and getting into a deck super cheap. And even if you build Infect without Noble Hierarch, the deck can still compete. Even if you build Infect without Fetch Lands and Dryad Arbor, the deck can still compete. Because if your opponent doesn't have the right answer, they just die. That's the beauty of a linear strategy. Elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its tactics. Now, let's not hit these deer as I'm getting ready to get home. Let's not do that. Elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its tactics. nothing if not effective. And at the end of the day, that's all I want to ask for if I'm trying to dip my toes into Modern for the first time. I want something that's going to give me a chance to win if my opponent doesn't have everything line up right for them. As long as my deck does what it's supposed to and my opponent stumbles even a little, I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there. That's what I want. And the other benefit, budget mana base wise, Infect is unreasonably cheap. Yavimaya Coast is the cheapest pain land by a substantial margin. Botanical Sanctum is kind of the forgotten child of the Kaladesh block fastlands. Everybody knows about how good Spire Bluff Canal is. Everybody knows how good Blooming Marsh is, because there's a lot of decks that play those two lands. Not a whole lot of decks that play Botanical Sanctum. So, gaining access, and then, of course, I always recommend getting your shock lands when they're in standard. So, I have mine. I already have my breeding pools. I have my Botanical Sanctums. Yavimaya Coast, I think, might be $2. So, from a budget builder's perspective, Infect is cheap. Like, it's one of the better decks to build if you need to build a cheap version of something to start the upgrade path. The only expensive card you really have to shell out for right away is Inkmoth Nexus, and then you can use the budget build to stair-step your way into a more competitive one, either by banking a lot of store credit or by trading your packs, or, holding on to a bunch of packs and then trading them aggressively for cards like Noble Hierarch, or, better lands in the form of Misty Rainforest and Flooded Strands. Whatever whatever path you decide to take in upgrading the deck, the fact of the matter is it doesn't change how the deck functions. So that's why I heartily recommend Infect right now. Modern is kind of in a state of flux. You're not in an unreasonable color combination when it comes to sideboard cards against the top decks. Like, everything about it just screams value. Like, it's exactly what you want as someone who's playing on a budget and wants to dip their toe into Modern. I said it last week, or the last episode I did of Homeward Path. We don't need necessarily to have control of everything in order to compete. Being proactive has its benefits. And linear decks are like the concept of proactivity ratcheted up to like 40. So at the end of the day, I can't really ask for anything else. That's all I want. I want a chance to compete, and I want a deck that is going to give me that chance. So that's all I got for this episode, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you're not watching, if you got questions, comments, concerns, send them to me. I'm on Twitter at HomewardPathMTG. On Facebook, my name is Adam Spain. Join the Facebook group, the Homeward Pathfinders. It's open invite. Just send a request. One of the admins will check you out. More than likely, we'll give you a shot, and then just don't be a horrible person. You'll get to stay. And if you like what I'm doing enough to keep helping me do it, patreon.com/HomewardPathMTG. This show and most everything I do is going to be free. At some point, there will be patron exclusive content. I haven't decided what it's going to be yet, but it's going to happen. But the vast majority of everything that I make is going to be free. But if you like what I'm doing enough to help me keep doing it, head over there. And not for nothing, if you want your deck featured on this show, be a patron of $3 or more. I haven't gotten any particularly exciting submissions. Luke sent me a pretty sweet Rakdos Aristocrats deck that I will have to get around to covering at some point, but I gotta find the right week to work it in. But it will get worked in, Luke. Don't worry. We're going to talk about it at some point. So that's all I have for this week again. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll catch you Thursday on this week's edition of the Homeward Path. Later.